when I spent a holiday in the Bahamas in 1993, I was walking along the street when I met a couple of tourists from a well-known Western country. And then the husband stopped and said, "Mr. Mandela." I said, "Well, many people mistake me for that chap." And he said, "Would I be entitled also to mistake you for that chap?" I say, "Well, you'll be doing what many people do." He then turned to his wife and said, "Darling, Mr. Mandela." She was completely unimpressed. And she said, "What is he famous for?" And the husband, in his embarrassment, dropped the voice. And he said, "Mr. Mandela, Mr. Mandela." And the dear lady said, "But I asked you, what is he famous for?" And without waiting for an answer from the husband, she turned to me and said, "What are you famous for?" I must confess I couldn't answer that question.
Hello and welcome to Mandela Madness. Last month on the 18th of July, the world celebrated a special day in history, Nelson Mandela's birthday. To honour the late president and philanthropist, the world held a special event with keynote speakers such as Barack Obama. This entire event was planned to commemorate the life of Nelson Mandela and celebrate the changes that he brought to the world. For many of you, that change will be most commonly remembered as the diversity and anti-racial agendas that he brought to a country that had been struggling with racial segregation for over a century. His campaign for human rights and the impact that he had as the first ever black elected president in a multiracial election started long before his release on February the 11th, 1990 from a South African prison. For another portion of you, his name is evocative of a more vital change, a change in the timeline, a change from the universe that you're used to. For you, when you learned of his death in 2013, it was to utter shock, for you had already known about his death over a decade beforehand. The most commonly accepted date of Nelson Mandela's death in this alternative timeline is the 23rd of July, 1991, almost a year and a half after his release from prison in this reality. This date has been proven by the refutable publication English Alive, which was written by a high school student and published in the same year, 1991, as a learning resource in schools across South Africa. This second view on the events surrounding Nelson Mandela's death has been the catalyst for a phenomenon known as the Mandela Effect, a term which was popularized online after his death was announced in 2013. This was the defining point where people began to come forward and to confirm that they had memories that differed to the history of this reality. For them, Nelson Mandela died in prison around or prior to 1991, which means that he passed away before ever going on to achieve any of those things that he's most commonly remembered for. So this begs the question, do those people who remember his death so clearly in the late 1980s or early 1990s have any recollection of the events that transpired with Nelson Mandela's life from 1994 through to 2013? And if so, what could this mean for the Mandela Effect? To find out if it's even possible for somebody who is Mandela affected to recall anything of Mandela's post-prison life, I sought to conduct an experiment. To do this, I needed to find an event that Mandela was involved in after prison, something substantial that would define him in history. The best factor, in my opinion, would be Mandela's appointment to the office of President of South Africa and his efforts in uniting a racially divided South Africa. To break this down to an even more specific event, I will redefine my factor to Mandela's efforts in the 1995 Rugby World Cup, in which he insisted that South Africa host the Games. He used this event to unite a racially divided South Africa by supporting the South African rugby team known as the Springboks. Due to the apartheid system that was heavily in place before his appointment as president, the team was most commonly made up of all white players. In the eyes of the people of South Africa, this team was seen as a bastion of institutionalized racism within the sporting world. Rather than condemning his team, as many of his supporters called for, Nelson Mandela embraced the Springbok, and he showed that sport could help them all rise above diversity. he showed us all that sport is like a universal language in which we are all equal.
Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair.
It was with this insight and a little bit of food poisoning that the South African team was able to beat the All Blacks and win the 1995 Rugby World Cup. The ripples of this win in the sporting world was monumentous, and it went on to inspire a 2009 film named Invictus, which was directed by Clint Eastwood. With the existence of this film, we now have the perfect factor to conduct our experiment, for this was released in 2009, just 4 years before the world learned of Nelson Mandela's death and before the popularity of the Mandela Effect began. Prior to filming this, I set up a survey monkey asking 5 simple questions to conduct my experiment. I received over 100 responses within the first 4 hours. Here are the questions that I asked and the answers that I received. The first question that I asked is, are you Mandela affected? Which 79% of people who participated in the survey answered that yes they are, which makes perfect sense because I posted this on a Mandela Effect subreddit. I've insisted on having selection bias for the first step of this experiment because I only want to focus this on people who have experienced the Mandela Effect. Question 2 asks if they noticed whether or not they were affected prior to 2013. 8% of people who took the survey admitted that they noticed effects prior to 2013, while 73% of people claimed that they noticed the Mandela effect after 2013. 19% of people claim that they are not affected, which means that 2 more people have been affected since question 1, which is a little bit concerning. Question 3 asks if the audience has seen or heard of the film Invictus. 16% have seen it, 39% have heard of it, and 45% have never seen or heard of it. Question 4 asks the audience if they have seen or heard of the film prior to 2013. 24.24% learned before 2013, while 16.16% learned about it after, and 59.6% have not seen it, which was a badly worded question on my part. The last question was irrelevant and a trap to make sure that the audience participated in this to the best of their ability. The question was, who played the lead role of Jacobus Pinheer? Was it Mark Wahlberg or was it Matt Damon? Oddly enough, some people thought it was Mark Wahlberg, but that's irrelevant. The main reason is because there was another lead actor who played another role in this, and that is Morgan Freeman, who played Nelson Mandela. So the takeaway from all of this is that 79% of people believe that they are affected by the Mandela effect. 73% of those people noticed these effects after 2013, after they learned about Nelson Mandela's death. The majority of people who took the survey had seen or heard of the film Invictus. The majority of people who took the survey have seen or heard of a film that primarily features Nelson Mandela after his release from prison when he's been elected president around 1994 to 1995. Of these people who knew about the film, the majority learned about it prior to 2013. So the question then stands, why do people who subscribe to the Mandela effect have clear memories of a film that features Nelson Mandela after his release from prison? And why do the majority of people who know of this film admit that they learned about this film prior to 2013 when he died? That is to say, how do they have memories from a reality that they claim that they are not from? If so many people claim to have memories of a film that they learned of prior to Nelson Mandela's death, about his rise to prominence as president of South Africa, then how can they claim that he died in prison before he ever became president? For the argument's sake that this survey is too small of a sample for the amount of people who say that they subscribe to the Mandela effect, I did run this survey 4 times with very similar results. All I did was change the link in my Reddit article to the new survey each time. I don't know why people insist on believing that Nelson Mandela died before he was able to accomplish the most defining achievements of his life, the events that immortalized him in history. Perhaps people got confused by an often confused former president of the United States, who said,
"Mandela's dead."
But don't forget how he said that.
I heard somebody say, "Where's Mandela?" Well, Mandela's dead because Saddam Hussein killed all the Mandelas.
I think we can all agree that Saddam Hussein didn't serve time in prison with Nelson Mandela. And if he did, he most certainly did not kill Nelson Mandela while in prison with him. And if you can't agree to that, at least the Bush administration's press secretary did agree that this was a mistake. And it was a misquote due to a misunderstanding of a story that released earlier that day about Nelson Mandela being hospitalized for treatment for a condition that he already had. Perhaps others were confused by this concert that appeared on the world news on the 11th of June 1988. This concert was held in the name of Nelson Mandela, but not to mourn his death, rather to celebrate his 70th birthday and call for his freedom from prison.
From ABC News, World News Saturday, here's Barry Seraphin.
Good evening. The fight against South Africa's apartheid policy took center stage, literally, today in London. Entertainers from around the world gathered for a giant rock concert honoring Nelson Mandela, seen by many as a symbol of the anti-apartheid movement. Mandela has been imprisoned in South Africa for nearly a quarter of a century. The concert was billed as a freedom fest.
68 artists entertaining for 10 hours in front of more than 70,000 people packed into London's Wembley Stadium.
Free, free, set them free.
An estimated 1 billion more watching on television as the concert is broadcast to 50 countries around the world.
Perhaps reports of his ongoing tuberculosis and constantly having to be hospitalized while in prison towards the end of his sentence, as well as being moved to a more stable prison later on in his prison sentence, along with a bit of news fatigue, is what led to people believing that he had passed on. In any case, Mandela did leave prison, and he did go on to lead a new life when he was released. He became known as a hero to South Africa. Hopefully his actions will echo through time and have a lasting effect on a country that is once again struggling with racial segregation. But you don't care about that, do you? You're all too busy worrying about a movie called Shazam that doesn't exist, or worrying about the spelling of the name of a children's book series. It's a really good way to spend your time, isn't it? I'd like to close off today's episode by reading a quote from the man himself, Nelson Mandela. What counts in life is not the fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. Thank you for watching. This has been Mandela Madness, and for more unoriginate content, please subscribe. For my next Mandela video that I make, I'm gonna do that with none of this stupid cunty character, you know. Okay, we did it. We made it to the end.